In the 15th century, England had a civil war so crazily complex that it became the real-world inspiration for the Game of Thrones. Two families fought for power, the Lancaster and the Yorks, in what will be known as the War of the Roses. My telling begins at the end of King Henry V of England, dead at 36, described as a warrior king who achieved great military success against the English rival the French during the 100-Year War. Much was expected of this great man's heir, the now King of England, the first Lancaster to the throne. The king in 1422 would be Henry VI, who was 9 months old. A baby. The English now had a baby for a king instead of the great warrior they just had. Unfortunately for England, the baby king was not much of a ruler. He did get to marry Margaret of Anjou, the niece of French King Charles VII. Margaret had enough political ambition to make up for the baby king, but not enough power to save England. Opportunity struck for the Yorks when in 1453, news of a crushing defeat for the English army at the hands of the French. King Henry VI broke mentally. His illness has been speculated to be schizophrenia, but we can't know for sure. All we do have are records saying he was so out of it that he was unable to govern. Richard of York, Duke of York, enters the play and becomes the Lord Protector, King's Hand from the Game of Thrones. While the ill Henry VI still technically holds the throne, the Yorks now effectively rule England. One day in 1454, King Henry VI snaps out of his illness as quickly as he broke into it. He kicks out the Yorks from power and has the Lancasters rule once again. The War of the Roses officially kicks off in 1455 when the Yorks attack the Lancasters at the Battle of St. Albans. The Yorks win and capture King Henry VI. Richard of York becomes Lord Protector all over again. But in 1456, Henry VI again kicks the Yorks out of power. In 1460, at the Battle of Northampton, on the Lancaster side were Queen Margaret, Henry VI, and loyal nobles. And on the other, for the Yorks, were led by Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick. Warwick the Kingmaker. We will just call him Warwick from here on out. The Yorks again capture Henry VI. Richard of York tries to claim the throne, but is dissuaded, and instead he signs the Act of Accord, where Henry VI can still stay king, but York is now the heir to the throne. Queen Margaret, having escaped the Battle of Northampton, rallies troops and attacks the Yorks at the Battle of Wakefield and kills Richard of York. This makes his son, Edward of March, head of the York and heir to the English throne. In 1461, Queen Margaret's forces freed Henry VI at the Second Battle of St. Albans. 6 weeks later, Edward of March defeats the main Lancaster army at Towton, sending Henry VI and Margaret into exile. Edward of March is later crowned King Edward IV. In 1464, King Edward IV marries Elizabeth Woodville, widow to a Lancaster noble against the wishes of Warwick, who wanted a marriage alliance with France but was fooled. Warwick then capitalizes on the pro-Lancaster revolt and tries to put Edward IV's brother, George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, on the throne. In 1469, after the Battle of Edgecote, King Edward IV is captured but released, because Warwick and George Plantagenet are just that unpopular. Despite their shortcomings, the two try again in 1470 but are exiled. In 1470, in France, King Louis XI says, "Hey, you hate King Edward IV. So do these guys, so why don't I help all three of you put the baby king back on the throne?" And that's what happens. Edward IV fights back, and things do not go well for the makeshift Lancaster allies. At the Battle of Barnet, George Plantagenet defects back to the York side, and Warwick's reinforcements are stuck in France. Bad weather. Warwick is killed trying to flee the battle. Later, at the Battle of Tewkesbury, Henry VI loses his only son and the battle. He passes shortly after. Margaret is ransomed to King Louis XI in 1475. King Edward IV passes in 1483, making his first son, Edward V, who happens to be at the perfect age to be king, 12 years old, which makes his uncle, Richard, brother to King Edward IV, the new king's Lord Protector. Richard has Edward IV's marriage declared bigamous, a word I had to look up, but basically means that someone was still technically married to another person while these two got hitched, so their marriage was false. Thus, Richard becomes King Richard III of England, and had Edward V and his brother Richard of Shrewsbury put in a tower of London, where they disappeared. All of this happening in the year 1483. Suffice it to say, Richard III was not popular. Enter Henry Tudor, a way-off sort of Lancaster who is now the closest male heir of any Lancaster and descendant of King Edward III, meaning he has a claim to the throne. He takes advantage of Richard's unpopularity, and at the Battle of Bosworth Field, King Richard III becomes the last English king to die in battle. Henry Tudor now becomes King Henry VII and marries the last descendant of Edward IV, Elizabeth of York. This joining of the family ends the Civil War and England's time in the Middle Ages.